I'll briefly talk about RES. So RES started 35 years ago. So as Alban was saying, in terms of the history of renewables, we've been around since pretty much the beginning. When RES first started, the idea of turbines were still quite conceptual. And the idea of utility scale turbines was, a far off distant thought. Because obviously we've had windmills for quite a while. And actually we are the largest renewable company that's independent in the world. So we've got quite a claim there. In terms of the history of the company, we started developing projects. So we created our own wind farms and developed those. And I think up until the last sort of 15 years, that was the sort of key focus. We work in 4 different technologies. One is wind, as we talked, and wind breaks down into 2. We've done obviously onshore, but also in the early days we were involved with offshore projects, doing projects in the North Sea for Centrica. So that was very much the early days of offshore. Now, if you want to be a company developing offshore wind farms, you have to have huge balance sheets like Dong and Iberdrola. So big utilities that are now in that space. But we still offer support services to them, helping them develop and construct projects. So that's the on and the offshore side of things. The other technology that we're in is solar, which you'll know is a very mainstream technology, and it's an interesting time for solar with the reduction of the cost of panels. And the final one, and that's probably the most exciting, in 2009, RES entered energy storage. So we started developing and looking into the concept of energy storage. So we're not talking about sort of small scale batteries, we're talking about utility scale batteries that fill containers and containers, rows of containers. So it's a really exciting time from that point of view. So RES as a company is a worldwide renewable company. We have offices in Canada and North America. We're also in UK and Ireland, France, Germany, the Nordics, which refer to Scandinavian countries, Turkey and Australia.
Well, I think they come in a variety of ways, but short answer is yes, there's a lot of issues around public acceptance of renewables, although we would have to be technology specific, because what people often have issues with or are presented to have issues with is wind farms. Solar, comparatively, is a much more simple technology to implement. It's quicker, but it also faces less resistance. So yeah, when building wind farms, we have various ways of coping with that. I think firstly, it's about the legal means that the communities have, but that we have as developers as well, to sort of challenge, but also go forward with projects sometimes. And it's about designing projects that don't impact the community. So we do everything we can, and I'd say we go beyond what most players have done ever, to limit, any environmental concerns, for instance, that communities may have, or even the impacts of, say, just visually seeing the wind farm. We do everything we can, and usually successfully, to mitigate all those concerns. So I think the signal, as you say, the market signal that targets represent, it has been hugely important. And I say has been for a reason. So far, it was one of the main ways of stimulating the industry, was to have targets that we would reach and that would have repercussions all the way down to the procurement of large electricity utilities. And this would then in turn make our projects economically viable. There has been a shift in the economics, really, for renewable projects, and hence in the necessity for targets. I would argue that those targets are now less essential as a market signal than they were before. That being said, they still have an important role to play, and as you said, they are the long-term goal, they are the long-term objective that then will stimulate local players to do what they can and for there to be a healthy competition, a healthy market. But really it's now much more of a secondary role, I would argue, with the economics and other ways of making it easier for renewable projects to come to life. These are now the primary mechanisms by which the market develops. I think it will have some impacts, but how big are those impacts is another question, and I think the main impacts I see will be with regards to minute rules on interconnections and other ways of exchanging power between the different countries, and of the implications regarding the price of carbon and other types of support mechanisms. And the restrictions that EU, for instance, might have imposed on the UK, those won't stand anymore. But other than that, I don't think it would stifle the industry altogether, because again, the economics are there, and that's really going to be the key, whether in the UK, the US, or elsewhere, really, to unlocking more renewables.
In other words, we sort of stand at the point when actually renewables are the cheapest form of generation, and in which case, then actually, whether there's Brexit or there's no Brexit, whether there's subsidies or there's no subsidies, actually the economics, as we're saying, doesn't really matter that much, because if the market conditions are right, we can build a wind turbine, we can build a solar plant, we can put some energy storage there, and you don't need all of that stuff. So therefore you would expect a kind of exponential level of growth from this point onwards of renewables.
I'd say that for a start, they've been great customers of ours, because as I was mentioning, with the apparition of targets and those requirements for those suppliers to procure renewables, they were our main customer type, the large utilities, for a long time. With regards to how serious competition they are, definitely this has shifted. Those large groups pretty much all have renewable arms now in different countries, so they are competitors. But so far I think it's fair to say that the market has been big enough, growing fast enough, that there has been room for everybody. And when you look at the volumes of renewables that have come online in the past decade alone, I'm absolutely fascinated by this double-digit growth every year. I mean, solar over the past 10 years, we're talking about a 5,000% increase, in the installed base or something like that, which is just amazing. At the same time, as costs have reduced over those same 10 years by about, say, 90%, if I'm correct, on the solar side. So, real shift in the market, enough space for everybody so far. And today, one of the main impacts of that competition is a healthy, lower cost for consumers. It's now more competitive than ever, and I think that's a good thing, even though it's hard for us. But
so the technologies that we work in are basically battery energy storage. So when we first moved into this market, we looked at the whole broad spectrum of technologies out there. There's pumped gas, there's hydro. I think there was about 130 technologies we looked at. And we felt at the time, and we agree that it's the right decision, that really only battery energy storage is going to offer the kind of flexibility that the grid and the market requires. So we've essentially gone down the route of the battery energy storage. The second question which we're asking, which is, is there a need, when will the need for storage become a reality? I think we're already there. And one of the places where, in the UK certainly, that we have and are in the process of developing projects is something called frequency response. So it's a totally different market. The traditional thinking, 5 years would have been, well, if you can put a battery on the side of a solar park, the sun will shine, the battery will store the power, and when the power is needed, it will essentially travel down cables to wherever it's going. Well, in actual fact, the batteries we've developed at the moment, and the projects that we've developed, are nothing to do with that principle. Essentially, we are ironing out the problems with the grid. And then you have other problems such as to overcome such expensive grid upgrades. So when you're having to build new power cables because for a certain amount of time a town or a city is exceeding its peak capacity. Well, if you can have a battery in that location, you can offset the need for expensive infrastructure upgrades. It becomes a very viable technology, none of which are connected to the traditional thinking of storage. So I think you've got to see storage as a new technology, and those who can think about the application and get the applications of it right will be the winners in the market, not necessarily the traditional thinking.
Indeed, storage is today competitive already on some of those applications. It's not new stuff that the grid didn't require before. It always required sort of to balance, demand and supply. But now that supply isn't anymore this big, chunky, predictable thing, but rather a mix of technologies that varies, according to weather, among other things. It's more and more important to procure those services for the grid operators. It's more and more, the challenge has grown, and batteries enable them to do that at the least cost. So I think it's quite good to say that, it's not with subsidies, and those battery projects, I remember when I started 5 years ago, we could count them on the fingers of one or two hands across the world. There was, one big project in Japan, a couple pilots being built here and there. Now I can tell you, I see the list growing pretty much every day. You see billion-dollar mergers happening, a lot of utilities actually buying also storage project developers. So for this mainstream market to now be generating, investing tons of money in it, it does reflect, I think, in the most obvious way, that the technology has matured. And the costs have come down. Again, 70% decline in battery costs in the past couple of years, and they plan another 70% decrease by 2030, last time I checked. So this is going to keep growing, we believe.